All right, welcome to this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome. If this is the first time you're joining in, welcome. Say hi if you're on Twitter, on LinkedIn, or YouTube. Say hi. I'm actually monitoring the comment section because sometimes people would post questions on the comment section of either Twitter or LinkedIn. Anyway, again, my name is Edwin Sarmiento, and if this is the first time you're joining in, welcome. I host these weekly, I want to say sessions or Q&A shows. I started off earlier this year where I would post a link in the description of the video below. So you can submit your questions way ahead of time and I can answer them. This week, we are, I don't want to say taking a break, but rather doing something different. And I wanted to focus on a trend that I've seen as people are submitting their questions. There's a certain aspect to how people would ask questions. And most of the time, they're highly technical questions. And let me put in a banner real quick. And to show you the focus of this week's session, it's not an ask me anything where I would answer your questions, but rather want to talk about the quality of the questions and the nature of the questions that people are asking. And sure, they are all about SQL Server, high availability, and disaster recovery. But the thing I've noticed is this. One, there is this variety of questions that people would ask. And sometimes the quality of the question that is being asked would tell me about the level of expertise, the experience, the knowledge, the skill that the person has as to the quality of the questions they're asking. And mainly because, again, great questions are something that only comes with experience, right? It's just like, when a 5-year-old would ask you a very simple math question, it's not quite the same as the math questions of a high school or somebody who's doing engineering, and they're doing engineering math. And the thing about this is, with a complex high availability solution like SQL Server always on availability groups, or even failover clustered instances, anything that runs on top of a Windows Server failover cluster, or any high availability solution for that matter, you can get a ton of questions. I mean, just look at the questions on Stack Overflow, Stack Exchange, on the Microsoft forums, everywhere, news groups, even on Twitter's SQL help hashtag. It will tell you that most of the questions being asked are highly technical. And the thing about high availability solutions is that there are not just variety of questions that you can ask, but also because of the different combinations, Windows Server versions, SQL Server versions, SQL Server editions, features, matches, high availability with disaster recovery. There's just so many of them that you can't really come up with what kind of questions you need to ask. And like I said, the quality of the questions people ask determine, and I kind of sense their level of expertise, their experience, and their background as well. But the thing here is, what I've noticed, like I said, most people ask technical questions because that's kind of like what they're trying to answer. How many replicas do I need for an availability group? What would be the witness configuration or the quorum configuration for my failover cluster? Do I switch from async to synchronous whenever I'm doing a failover, whether it's manual or automatic? Where do I place the witness? Is it on a production data center? If I have a stretched cluster, how do I tweak the network settings? And again, you can come up with so many questions. And the challenge with these questions is that it's a never-ending sequence of questions, because one question would come up with another, right? And as you are asking these questions, you may be able to answer the question that you currently have, but as you are moving towards getting the answer to your question, you come up with another question. And that's why I want to talk about this topic. are you asking the most important question about your SQL Server always on availability group solution? And it's very easy to find answers to your questions nowadays, given the nature of the internet. You post a question on forums or news groups, on Stack Overflow. You can search for it using your favorite search engine, Google, Bing. Hopefully nobody uses GeoCities in Lycos and Alta Vista nowadays. Man, those are the days. Type in the search, the keywords that you want to search for, and then you can get a billion of results on your favorite search engine, right? You could always look for articles, videos. You can watch videos on YouTube. You can subscribe to Udemy, LinkedIn Learning, PluralSight. You could read articles, everything. There's a bunch of answers to every question that you could potentially ask, right? There is no limit to the question that you can ask, and the results are all out there. But what's ironic is the fact that the more you ask those questions, the more the deeper you get into the rabbit hole, and the further away you are from really answering your question. Because as technical professionals, this question, the most important question that you should be asking, is not something that was a part of our training, of our exposure to technology. And this is something that I ask a lot of my clients and a lot of my customers, mainly because this is the most important question as far as I'm concerned. Forget about the version of Windows, forget about the version of SQL Server, forget about the combinations of high availability, disaster recovery, feature this, edition that, combination this, because there's an infinite number of combinations of everything that you could think of, but this, by far, is the most important question. And that is the why question. This is the most important question that you need to ask. And it's interesting because whenever somebody asks me a question and I ask them the why question, I get pushbacks. Sometimes they get annoyed because I ask a series of why questions. Like there was one time somebody approached me after I did a presentation, and he was asking, we have this 28 node failover cluster, and we are doing both an upgrade and a migration to a new data center. How do we go about it? And that in itself for me is something to really be curious about. Because for one, why would you have a 28 node failover cluster? That's one. And so I asked the why question. So why do you have a 28 node failover cluster? And that's exactly how they would respond typically when I ask the why question. And the follow-up to their response to my why question is, so why? And again, people get annoyed, maybe because when we were kids, when we start asking questions, we are getting shot down by our parents. Stop asking the why questions, and they become so annoyed, and we take that as something that we shouldn't do. And that's also probably the reason why we stop at asking the why questions. But there's consequences to not asking the why questions. The first one is that it causes more confusion. I'll give you a very simple example. One of the questions asked a couple of weeks ago in the AMA sessions was that, how do I configure my file share how do I configure my quorum, the cluster configuration, so that I can have a witness and make sure that my stretched failover cluster, meaning to have a failover cluster across two data centers, and make it very stable and reliable. Okay. Now, it could be easy to say, well, put your file share witness on a third data center. They're asking a how question, and when you say, sure, configure the file share witness and put it on another data center, because that's what Microsoft is saying, or that's what AWS is saying. But when I asked the question in the first place, so I'm curious though, why do you have a 2-node Windows Server failover cluster that is stretched across data centers? And I get crickets. And that's because, for one, the more how questions we ask, the more we are confused because we're relying on the technical response based on the how question. How do we do this? And then you end up configuring it that way, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, the more you answer the how questions, you get to ask more questions. Okay, I'm going to put the file share witness on a third data center. Well, wait a second. Which third data center? Should I put it on a colo facility? Should I put it on AWS? Should I put it on Azure? And because the question asked was all about the how, the answers leading up to the first question would then come up with a series of other questions that would lead you further away from the real problem. And this is a again something that a lot of tech professionals are instinctively drawn to, mainly because we are so used to getting our hands dirty, working on technology challenges, and we just want to solve the problem immediately. Excuse me. So that's the first thing. When you don't ask the why questions, you get all the more confused. So let's say, for instance, your manager tells you, we want to deploy availability groups. We wanted to, well, for one, the instinctive response of any tech professional is, so what version of SQL Server, what version of Windows, how do we configure it? And then you go about looking for keywords on your favorite search engine, asking how many replicas, how many cluster nodes, what version of Windows, what version of SQL Server. And then you start and get into the drawing board, sketching, or you can use PowerPoint or Visio, whatever tool you want to use, and then creating an architecture diagram of what you've already envisioned. Well, my manager told me to build an availability group. Well, here's the design. Oh, we need 2 replicas here and 1 replica over there, and we need to connect them in the network, and we need to configure. But we never bothered asking the question why. Why does he want an availability group? Did he really want an availability group? Is that what the business really needs? And so, because you've already gone ahead and not asked the why question, it leads you further and further away from the real problem. And this is a big mistake. Because, for one, you've already bought the hardware, assuming you've already gone to production, you've already bought the hardware, you've already bought the licenses, you've already configured this, you've hired the right people, and so you thought. You've done a lot of these things, but still have not answered the why question. Why do you want an availability group in the first place, right? So because you are focused on not asking the why questions, you get all the more confused because now you have to ask more questions in addition to how do I build this? And it's not addressing the real problem. That's the first one. And by the way, if you might as well take notes, get a pen and paper ready, write down, take notes. This is golden. The second one is you end up doing more unnecessary work. More unnecessary work. I'll just use the same example that I used in the beginning or earlier, where your manager told you, we are building an availability group. I'll let you take care of it. And then you start asking questions like, okay, how many replicas, how many cluster nodes, what version of Windows, what version of SQL Server, and then we'll test it. And then you built it. Oh, we figured we need to tweak some of the network settings, and you go ahead and do tweak the network settings. Oh, we need this. And then you kind of made progress because you made it work in production, or rather in the development environment, in your test environment. Now you're ready to move into production. Once you're in production, there are new issues that you're facing, and now you have to deal with those, including managing and maintaining and administering your always on availability group solution, or any high availability solution for that matter. You're doing more work, yet you never bothered asking the why question. Why do you need an availability group in the first place? And this leads to, aside from the fact that it leads to you putting in more hours at work, you end up becoming more overworked. You probably heard me talk about, us tech people ending up in a more overworked state where you get so burnt out and stressed out. And a lot of people would say, well, it's just the nature of the job. Well, no, we're putting in more work. We're doing more than we need to because we don't ask the most important question, and that is the why question. Why do we need this in the first place? Okay. And the third reason why you that leads people to have all of these side effects of not asking the why question is what strikes me every time I would go and look at a client environment. The third reason is that a temporary win creates bad practices, right? You ask a question, you test it out, you try to figure things out on your own, you read something on a blog post, you try it, didn't work, then you go ahead and do another one, didn't work, something that you've done in your dev and your staging environment or your test environment, oh, it works, let's roll it out in production. You think because it worked, then you can go ahead and roll it out in production. I've seen this so many times where, I'll give you a very classic example. One client of mine from a couple of years ago, they built a stretch cluster that spans across multiple data centers. And what they kind of experienced was, because they were, I think it was a 6-node failover cluster, 3 nodes in production and 3 nodes in the DR site. And with the way things were configured, they thought that the outages that they're experiencing is caused by misconfiguration on the cluster heartbeat settings. And I talk about that a lot in some of the previous videos. And I asked them, so why did you configure your cluster heartbeat settings like this? Oh, because we want to prevent the outages from happening. We've had several outages within the past couple of weeks. And just by tweaking the settings, we no longer have them. Okay, so tell me more. Can you tell me more about the network bandwidth? And they explained, they gave me some insights about how the network bandwidth is that connects their production and DR data center. And then I asked the network engineers, so tell me, what's the traffic look like? And they told me that the network bandwidth is saturated almost all the time. Turns out that the outages were caused by their network bandwidth no longer being enough for their current workload. Because it's not just SQL Server that goes through that pipe. Their Active Directory replication goes through that pipe. Other traffic goes through that pipe. But because they think configuring the network settings, the cluster heartbeat network settings, that is, would prevent the outages from happening, they thought, okay, this is how we would configure all of our clusters from then on, right? A temporary win becomes a practice. And you probably, let's take this, and make this a little bit more practical. Just try doing something outside of tech. Maybe rehearsing on the piano, playing golf. I'm using analogies that I'm not even aware of. But if you kind of build habits, because that's how you practice, sooner or later it becomes your normal. Until a professional would then tell you that's not how you're supposed to do it, because you're not relaxing your arm when you hit the golf club and so on and so forth. And this is the thing. With a temporary win, you start to think that this is best practice because it worked for us, not realizing that there could be a a much worse problem that a simple configuration is simply hiding. We're trying to solve a symptom instead of getting into the real root cause of the problem and addressing that. Those are just simply three consequences for not asking the why questions. And the thing is, again, we're not trained to ask the why questions. And that's one of the reasons why we get pushbacks when we start asking why. Using the same example as that I used earlier, when somebody says, you go ahead and do this, we don't instinctively ask, why do you want me to do this? What is the outcome that we're trying to achieve? Okay. And that's why this, as far as I'm concerned, is the most important question that you need to ask with your always on availability group solution, with your SQL Server high availability solution, whether it's for a failover clustered instance or an availability group or any high availability solution for that matter. Now, here's the thing. Why do you need to ask the why questions? And, I talked about the consequences of not asking the why questions. Let's talk about why do you need to ask the why questions? Asking the why questions, first and foremost, it puts the focus on the real solution instead of the workaround. It puts the focus on the real solution instead of the workaround. Using the example that I used from one of my clients a couple of years ago, where they simply tweaked the cluster heartbeat settings, if I'm not mistaken, the cross-subnet delay and the cross-subnet threshold parameter values, they tweaked that. And I asked them, so why did you tweak those cluster heartbeat settings? And that's when they came up with, yeah, we tweaked it because we're getting outages. Now we are no longer getting outages. Sure, you've solved the symptom, but not the root cause. And then I asked again, so why are you getting outages in the first place? We actually don't know. We just tweaked it because somebody else told us that we should tweak it. And so they did. Upon asking further why questions, just like what I mentioned earlier, we found out that their network connectivity is no longer enough. The bandwidth is no longer enough for their current need. Now, there are, again, a couple of different ways for you to resolve that issue, that the network bandwidth is no longer enough. But the thing is, without asking the why questions, we wouldn't be able to nail down the real problem. The real problem was they don't have enough network bandwidth, and that is why it is causing outages. Because when you start to think about it, the secondary nodes on the DR site could not communicate with the nodes on the production data center. There's some network latency, and so the nodes in the primary data center would think, hey, we cannot contact those nodes in the DR data center. Oh, we lost quorum. Let's shut the entire cluster down. Okay. And because of this, they thought, well, that's the case. Let's bump up the cluster heartbeat setting parameter values. Sure, it solved the problem temporarily, but the real problem is still there. They're still seeing that their secondary replicas in the DR site are not getting caught up easily. The log records are piling up. I want to use the word piling up, but there's backlog of transaction log records that have not been redone, not because the replicas don't have the compute resources. They've got enough CPU and memory resources. It's just that the network bandwidth is not enough for sending all those transaction log records across the wire. And that's the thing. When you ask the why questions, it puts the focus on the real solution or the real problem that needs to be solved instead of just coming up with a workaround. What they did was simply a workaround. It temporarily solved the problem, but it's still there. The real root cause is network bandwidth is not enough. Okay, so that's the first thing. Asking the why questions help you put focus on the real problem so that you can get the real solution instead of just trying out some workarounds. Because the thing about coming up with workarounds is, number one, we're not really good at documenting. We just do it. It worked. Good. Somebody raised the ticket. You try something else. It worked. good, but we're not documenting it. Next thing you know, we got like 24 other, I don't know why I said 24. You now have like 24 other configuration that you've applied on a particular setup, but you don't know what they are specifically and in what order you apply them. So the next time you start building a new infrastructure, let's say you're migrating off of that old platform to a new platform, maybe from physical to virtual or from on-premises to the cloud, you kind of not know exactly. Why? Because again, we're not really good at documenting. We just, okay, this is what it is. We'll do some audits, but then we're not sure exactly how and why, right? That's why it pays to really focus on the why question, asking the why questions. That's the first one. The second one is that it opens up your creativity to explore other solutions other than the ones that you've thought of. This really reminds me of a client a couple of years ago where they want to move from on-premises to the cloud. And the strategy was to do a lift and shift. That's it. Lift and shift. They want to take their existing infrastructure on premises and move it to the cloud. And when they did the math, it turned out that it is going to be more expensive on the cloud than it is on premises. So much for the promise of the cloud to reduce your operational cost. But when they did the math in a span of 2 years, it will be twice as expensive as what they have on premises, given everything the same, right? And so I asked the why question. I'm just curious though, before we even before we even start the project, why do you have an available group in the first place? And this is a 3-node Windows Server failover cluster with a 3 replica AG. Every single AG is a they have like 2 available groups running on one node and another available group running on another node, and the other node is simply for standby. And I asked, so why do you have an available group in the first place? They were kind of surprised when I asked that question because that was not a part of the project. The project was to move everything on premises and put it on the cloud. And so I asked, why do you have an available group in the first place? They're a software as a service company, and they wanted to have high availability when they're rolling out either application patches, meaning hot fixes for the app, or installing Windows or SQL Server patches. And I asked them, so let's say application hot fixes, bug fixes, how often do you actually do these? On average, they would do like weekly. It would turn out that on a weekly basis, they would only need about 2-hour downtime in order to push the changes, apply them, and the application will only be down for like 2 hours. And then I asked, so what about Windows and SQL Server updates? When you're installing cumulative updates, when you're installing Windows security patches, how often do you do that? Once a month? And when you add the numbers, how long would that take? Well, that's an additional 2 hours. So you're telling me you built a 3-node failover cluster with a 3 replica availability group because you only need it for a total of 6 hours in an entire month, okay? 6 hours in an entire month, and that's even spread out across multiple weeks? Like, yeah. Here's a design that they've maintained for years, because they started off with SQL Server 2012 to 2016, and it was 2017 when we were moving them to the cloud. They've maintained something that they only needed for overall total of 6 hours in a month. And that's when we started taking a step back, going back to the drawing board, and re-architected everything. Their lift and shift strategy, taking everything on premises and putting it on a cloud, has become, let's re-architect everything while still meeting our overall objective. Asking the why question about why do you have an available group in the first place forced them to, number one, put the focus on the real solution or the real problem that needed the real solution. And number two, opened them up to other possible solution, things that they've never thought of. And so what we ended up doing was we created a single node failover cluster with a single replica AG. Some of you might be thinking, is that even supported? Yes, it is. Well, your operational procedures would make it highly available. We looked at the SLAs and all of that. And it literally cut down their cost to migrate to the cloud, which for them made it possible for them to achieve cost reductions moving to the cloud. But it only became possible when we started asking the why questions. When they were asking about how do we do this, we move from on-premises to the cloud, they were all focused on the how without asking the why. When I started asking the why question, until we really are clear about what it is that they're trying to accomplish in the first place and what goal they're trying to achieve, that was when it became clear that the lift and shift strategy was not the right solution for them. First off, asking the why questions, but to focus on the real problem so you can get the real solution instead of coming up with workarounds. Second, it opens you up. It opens your creativity so that you can come up with solutions that you've not thought of before. Because, when you start to focus your attention on one thing, you drown out all the possibilities of what could potentially be a solution, and you ignore, it's not going to work, that's not going to work. Well, the fact that you already are thinking it's not going to work, your brain's telling you, well, it's not going to work, right? So that's the second one. The third one is this, and this is really more important. When you ask the why questions, it helps you solve the root cause of the problem instead of just addressing the symptom. And a lot of the times when we're fixing problems, we focus on the symptoms because we think that is the real problem. And of course, by nature of how problems come up, you solve the symptom, another problem comes up. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. One problem comes up, you solve that problem, another problem resurfaces, not realizing they're all a byproduct of the same root cause. Okay. Asking the why question allows you to really get to the root cause. And because you're solving the root cause, it prevents other issues from happening as well. In fact, that client that I talked about, where they have this 2-node Windows Server failover cluster stretched across 2 different data centers, when I asked them that, and said, well, that's what we saw from one of the presentations that Microsoft did. And I'm like, is that exactly what you need? Because they're getting outages after outages after outages. And I said, re-architect it. When they re-architected it, they, of course, still the exercise of asking the series of why questions until we were clear on what really is the problem, what really is the need, and what goal they're trying to achieve. Because at the end of the day, technology is simply there to solve business problems and not the be-all, end-all, be-all, right? It's just us technical professionals, so we think of it that way. But the reality is every technical solution is there to solve a business need. If it doesn't solve a business need, it's just a technical solution. No problem to solve, right? And so when we really got into what is the real reason why they wanted to deploy an availability group with 2 replicas across 2 different data centers, they kind of reevaluated and said, well, we just wanted something for disaster recovery. Okay. Log shipping can do that. Backup, copy, and restore could do that. And you don't have to pay for really expensive enterprise edition licenses. You don't need to complicate your setup if all you need is disaster recovery. And then you have your backups. And again, this is the thing about really getting clear on the why you want to do what you do. The how would follow. The how and the what would follow if you are clear on the why. It is critical to your success as a sysadmin or a DBA taking care of SQL Server high availability solutions to be clear and to train yourself to ask the why questions. even if people are pushing back on it. Because one of the reasons why people push back on you asking the why questions and why they don't want to respond is because they're also going to get forced to really think about it. And most of the time, they don't want to think about it, right? They just say, do this. But if you get really, really clear on the why, the reason why they want this in the first place, the real reason, not the superficial reason. Anybody can come up with a superficial reason. I want to build an 8-node failover cluster with an 8 replica availability group. And by the way, I'll build another one and configure a distributed availability group between those two because I want to put it on my resume. Is that really what the business needs? Or is that just something you thought of so you could put it on your resume? It doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter how skillful you are. It doesn't matter how much experience, how much expertise, even if you're the best in the world at what you do. If what you do does not solve a business problem, I don't want to say it's useless. It's just a waste of energy. It's just a waste of time, resources, because it's not solving a business problem. Our responsibility as technical professionals is to provide solutions that solve a business need. If it doesn't solve a business needs, it's just a thought experiment. Might as well just do it on your lab, right? And so these are the things that you have to be clear about, the consequences of not asking the why questions and why you need to ask your why questions. Because otherwise, again, you'll be working a ton and just trying out so many different things without really addressing the real problem. And that's why it is important for you to ask the why question, because this is the most important question that you need to ask whenever you're deploying a SQL Server availability group solution, or even a failover clustered instance, or any high availability or disaster recovery solution, right? That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. And if you end up in a situation where I need help, and there's just so many things to consider, it gets so confusing, and I can't really figure things out on my own. I've read all of the articles, I've read all of the documentation, I still couldn't make anything out of it. Use the link on your screen, schedule a call, and let's have that conversation. I can guarantee you in an hour's time, you could get more out of the conversation and get you the clarity of what you need to do compared to spending a ton of time trying to figure things out on your own. If you need help with anything always on availability groups or anything SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery, use that link on the screen, schedule a call, and let's have a conversation. Like I said, I can guarantee you'll get the most out of that 45-minute to an hour worth of conversation that you will ever had in the months that you've been doing things on your own, right? Again, this is all there is to this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and I'll see you again in the next episode. Enjoy the rest of your, I can say weekend, because it's Friday. Enjoy the rest of your week, the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again